Peter Jennings.
Good evening. We begin tonight with the news that startled Mikhail Gorbachev as much as anyone today. This morning in Moscow, one of his closest confidants, the former Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze, resigned. In fact, he's now the former Foreign Minister. Mr. Shevardnadze said his old friend Gorbachev was being pushed dangerously away from democracy. And what he called one of the shortest and saddest speeches of my life, Mr. Shevardnadze said he hoped his resignation would jolt those who want to reform the Soviet Union and Mr. Gorbachev to attention. In Moscow, ABC's Jim Laurie.
It was an enormous shock. Shevardnadze resigning rather than be a party to the return of dictatorship. Shevardnadze sounded an alarm to liberal reformers to speak up before it's too late. He warned reformers had gone into hiding, and young men wearing the epaulets of colonels were boasting of new power. Shevardnadze made plain he fears hardline communists, he called them reactionaries, who were trying to force Mikhail Gorbachev into using the military to suppress democracy in the name of law and order. He insisted, though, he was still very much a Gorbachev backer.
I am his friend. I am his supporter. I will support perestroika and democracy to the end of my days. Dictatorship will not prevail. The future is freedom and democracy.
With that, Shevardnadze walked out. Outside in the hall, the conservatives who Shevardnadze views as threats to democracy were elated.
Shevardnadze has decided at the right time to leave the sinking ship.
After a short recess, Mikhail Gorbachev took to the podium. He said the resignation was a surprise even to him. Gorbachev had been considering Shevardnadze as his vice president in a new cabinet. I felt insulted, he said. We agreed to talk this over. I don't regard this matter as closed. For 5 years, Shevardnadze has been Gorbachev's closest ally in pushing for domestic reform and closer ties to the West. Liberals, like the deputy mayor of Moscow, said the resignation should provide a lesson to Gorbachev.
I think that Gorbachev should take this Shevardnadze's affair as a very serious signal that he is too far from the mainstream of real reform process.
The resignation comes as Gorbachev is fighting for more power and trying to form a new cabinet. The question is whether Shevardnadze's protest will rally reformers or leave conservatives with the upper hand. Jim Laurie, ABC News, Moscow.
A little earlier, we talked about this with our resident analyst of Soviet affairs, Robert Legvold, the director of Columbia University's Harriman Institute. The question was simple. What's going on here?
I see it as both a desperate and a sad act. A desperate act because Shevardnadze has evidently decided that he can no longer influence Gorbachev from the inside and has to engage in this public drama. But a sad act because this is really the first of the major architects of perestroika and change in the Soviet Union that's saying it just isn't working, and he's leaving the scene.
Well, why do you think he did it right now?
Because I think he's very concerned about the evolution of Gorbachev's policy in the midst of this growing crisis in the Soviet Union. Gorbachev, rather than facing the fundamental problems of economic reform, political reform, instead is focusing on the winter's emergency, the food shortages, the collapse of the Federation, and he's doing so by resorting to basically authoritarian techniques or means. I think Shevardnadze feels that this is a dead end and that there's no way back off this slippery slope if he starts down that direction.
Give us a sense of the Soviet Union overall in terms of the forces. Which are presently prevailing in your view? Those that want more radical, looser, liberal, democratic reform, or those which want the iron hand of discipline reinstated?
I think it's very difficult to identify which set of political forces has the upper hand at this stage, but the chaos of the Soviet Union, the growing crisis, and indeed the political stalemate which accentuates the other problems, favor those people who believe in the iron hand and in restoring law and order. And at some point, even the population will sit still or accept that kind of alternative the way things are going.
Bob Legvold, thanks very much. Well, if Mr. Gorbachev won the Nobel Prize for Peace this year, it was Mr. Shevardnadze who did the legwork, much of it with the Secretary of State, James Baker. They met 19 times this year alone. And building a working relationship with Mr. Shevardnadze's replacement will not be easy. At the State Department, ABC's John McCarthy.
Secretary Baker, though clearly concerned, tried to put the best possible face on it, saying how pleased he was that President Gorbachev promised no change in foreign policy.
We, of course, expect that to be the case, and we will be watching events closely in the weeks ahead.
Baker admitted the U.S. is worried by Shevardnadze's warning about a dictatorship taking over the Soviet Union.
We would obviously be foolish, I think, not to take the warning in Minister Shevardnadze's resignation statement seriously.
For the U.S., the departure of the foreign minister could have an immediate impact. On the Persian Gulf, it was Shevardnadze and Baker who painstakingly worked out a way for the U.S. and Soviet Union to act together, even though Moscow was once Baghdad's biggest arms supplier. Baker and Shevardnadze were frequently on the phone once or twice a day to iron out problems. It will be more difficult now. On arms control, the U.S. and Soviet Union have a major treaty nearly ready for signing, one that would make deep cuts in each side's long-range nuclear weapons. On this and earlier arms treaties, Shevardnadze has been the key to getting the job done.
Shevardnadze has been the most anti-military member of the Soviet leadership. He has time and again identified the military as the obstacle to a successful, sensible Soviet foreign policy.
With Shevardnadze out, one influential voice against the military, against the old way of doing things, is gone. He had become a friend to Baker.
On a purely personal note, I would have to tell you that I'm going to miss him.
But more important for the United States, Shevardnadze was a voice in the Kremlin that an American Secretary of State could trust. John McWethy, ABC News, the State Department.
In a moment, we'll have the Gulf story. Will the U.S. be ready or not to fight Saddam Hussein by January the 15th? There's a tough new Security Council resolution today deploring Israel's deportation of Palestinians.